So your causal factors are kind of intermediate scale. They're not the highest level factors, but they're also not micro factors. What if someone put forward the idea that in the Chinese case, what was distinctive about German colonial behavior in China was a very specific institutional fact. It was the fact that the colonial administrators were all trained in the XYZ School for Colonial Administrators, and there was a very specific program of study there, which gave them a set of tools and modes of dealing with social problems, which led to a very distinctive form of behavior. That I would call that a very micro kind of institutional level explanation. I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, that actually was the case, broadly speaking, say in the German Overseas Colonial Service and Diplomatic Corps in China, that most of the people who were posted went through basically two main educational institutions in Germany before being sent over, at least by the end of the 19th century. And there was a certain homogeneity probably that was introduced among them. But nonetheless, in the colonial overseas states, these people educated through these schools weren't the only grouping. There were also groupings directly from the military who came in, and there were often merchant or capitalist or trading groups as well. So the three main elite groups that I look at in the German overseas colonial states are, broadly speaking, bourgeois or capitalist, aristocratic noble military men, and people who've gone through those kinds of educational institutions that you've talked about. Now, to understand the approach of the third group, one does need to go back to and examine the schools that they were trained in, the curriculum, and so on and so forth. That's a key aspect of the kind of ethnographic representations, as I put it, that they bring into the colonial field, they bring with them. In other words, people are often exposed to a different set of pre-colonial representations of the Chinese, of the African, of the South African, and so on before they go into the field, and that's a necessary part of the explanation. Whether that's micro or macro, I'm not sure. I have actually a difficult time often determining what's meant by micro versus macro. The only distinction that I've been able to draw in my own work is between micro, meaning within the psyche, in other words, psychic mechanisms, and macro being roughly equivalent to social mechanisms. But I realize there are people like, say, Emanuel Wallerstein, who believe that there are mechanisms operating on the scale of the entire globe, the division of the globe into core and periphery and semi-periphery and so on, which some people think is more macroscopic than field, but I think it's kind of almost a false spatialization of scale. I'm not sure that mechanisms can be scaled so easily.
Determined level.
Yeah, I think the more relevant thing for mechanisms is the scale of their extendability. In other words, how far does a given mechanism like field reach? Does it reach into pre-colonial, pre-imperial? Does it reach into imperial China before the Europeans begin to invade? Does it reach into the Ming and Qing empires? Does it reach back? Can you analyze pre-colonial, pre-colonized China using a category like field, for example? Can you look at the competition among mandarins as a field-like competition? That's about the extendability of the concept of field, and that's a level of scale that I can understand. That's extendability, but whether that's a move toward macro, I'm not sure.
When you think about really large historical changes like the fall of the Roman Empire,
right?
I think there's a desire that the size of the outcome should be in some way counterbalanced by the size of the cause. So it's kind of disappointing to have small causes. There was lead in the drinking vessels, and that's the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire.
Very nicely put. Yeah, I agree with you completely. That there's a false assumption that the size of the empirical level historical outcome should be the same size, as it were, as the mechanism.
Which is often actually probably not the case.
Often not the case.
Large outcomes are probably determined by an aggregation of many, many small causal factors. Which is possible in the case of colonialism.
Or many, many causal factors. Let's even leave out the word small. I mean, the mechanism, for example, if we think about some of the mechanisms that led to the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, some of them probably were group dynamics within the Politburo and things like that, and some of them might have been political economic ones about the decline in productivity and welfare in East Germany or in
Right.
other countries in Eastern Europe. Whether one of those is ontologically bigger than the other, I'm not sure. I can't make a lot of sense of that. Whereas the territorial basis of East Germany, or the number of people who were kept in Soviet domination, that's kind of a quantifiable factor, which I can translate into bigness. But that's not at the level of the causal mechanism explaining the question that we're trying to talk about.
If you had a kind of anal school-like view,
Right.
that it's longue durée, it's great big population shifts and
Right.
price shifts and so forth.
Right.
Those intuitively seem to me to be large social factors.
Yes.
They're over a very long period of time, and
Yes.
they affect a large territory.
Yeah,
So-
those are large events, but those aren't necessarily explained by a mechanism that can be classed as either micro or macro.
Well, unless that actually is the mechanism. It's rising population pressure, which isn't even noticed
I
at the
see.
local level. But the mechanism, what that produces, is a kind of a systemic tendency towards famine or something like that.
Okay,
So you have a causal argument that moves from population change, imperceptible generation to generation, which is actually being invoked to explain something massive like a rising tendency towards civil disobedience or whatever.